Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The Ukraine war seems to be showing no sign of ending. U.S. President Donald Trump, who once promised to stop the fighting within a day of taking office, is now closing on 100 days with little real progress. His latest peace plan, asking Ukraine to give up Crimea, has been flatly rejected by Kyiv. On the ground, Russia is pushing harder, claiming new victories and even admitting North Korean troops are fighting alongside them. At the same time, Ukraine's resistance is showing signs of strain. Despite a brief meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy at Pope Francis's funeral, deep gaps still remain. So with diplomacy stalling and the battlefield even growing bloodier, the prospects for a ceasefire seem uncertain. So at this point, is there still room for a breakthrough, or could the situation worsen moving forward? For answers to this, we invite Min Jung-hoon, professor at Korean National Diplomatic Academy, here in the studio with us. Welcome, Professor.
My pleasure, always.
And also joining us from Australia is Dr. Malcolm Davis, senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Great to have you.
Thank you very much.
So let's discuss our discussion with Professor Min first. So like I said, President Trump presented his final mediation proposal last week that effectively requires Ukraine to cede territory, specifically Crimea. Ukraine has firmly rejected this proposal. What are the core issues at stake here?
Yes, as you mentioned, the Trump government is leading the ceasefire negotiations, but it seems to be slower than expected. And I think that there are the two main issues for the negotiations: the territorial division and security guarantees for Ukraine. And the first, regarding the territorial division, Trump government want to recognize most the current borders, specifically Russia's annexation of Crimea and the recognition of 4 Russian-occupied Ukrainian regions as Russian territory. But as you mentioned, Ukraine rejected the proposal that it will concede Crimea. So it is expected that it will take us some more time to narrow the gap on the territorial division. Meanwhile, regarding the security guarantees for Ukraine, it seems to be clear that U.S. would not allow Ukraine to join the NATO. Instead, Trump government want to have the minerals deal with Ukraine as an alternative, and European allies will deploy a kind of a peacekeeping force to Ukraine, which would make Ukraine a neutral zone between Russia and the NATO member states in Europe. But nothing has been revealed about the details of the ceasefire negotiations yet. So it will take some more time before we can figure out what's going on there. In addition, it seems that Russia want to delay the negotiations to earn time to fully restore the control for Kursk from Ukraine and to get more of what it wants from the negotiations. But recently, it was reported that Russia fully restored the control for Kursk, and the United States, the Trump government, is about out of tolerance about Russia's delay. So I expect that Russia will be more active to make a progress for the ceasefire deal in the coming weeks.
Right. So as of now, Ukraine's interest hasn't been met with Trump's latest proposal. Now, let's also bring in Dr. Davis to the conversation. So despite Ukraine's strong opposition to the final proposal by Trump, the U.S. president stated in a media interview that the fact that Russia's not occupying all of Ukraine is already a major concession. Why do you think the U.S. is putting forward statements that seem to be in favor of Russia?
Well, it's not a case of seem to be, they are in favor of Russia. I mean, I think to suggest that, Russia not occupying all of Ukraine as a major concession just seems incredulous to me. Here we have an aggressive state that has initiated a war against a neighbor, a democratic state, Ukraine. So you have Russia invading Ukraine in 2022, brutally attacking Ukraine. And now you have the United States seemingly trying to create a peace package or a peace plan that effectively favors the aggressor. So it is bizarre that you have a situation now where the Trump administration essentially seems to be trying to create a peace plan that essentially gives Russia everything that it wants. And I think this might be explained by perhaps Trump wanting peace as quickly as possible, potentially at any cost. But as we've seen from history, rarely does that actually lead to a lasting peace. We only need to look back to 1938 and the Sudetenland and peace in our time to see where that led. And I think we're at the risk of falling into the same trap here in terms of Ukraine and Russia. So it is really rather concerning that you have the Trump administration seemingly prepared to do peace at any price, even if that severely disadvantages Ukraine, which is the victim of Russian aggression.
Right. So it's indeed a striking position from Washington, especially considering its past stance on Ukraine during the Biden administration. Now, in addition to this, Trump is pressuring Ukraine by warning that if no agreement is reached, the U.S. will completely withdraw from mediating the war. Professor Min, how do you assess the outlook for a ceasefire negotiations with this situation?
Well, basically, I think although it's going a little bit slower than expected, but I expect that Russia and Ukraine will be more active, and the ceasefire negotiations will make a progress in the coming weeks. And President Trump recently mentioned that Russia might have no intention of reaching an agreement, and he could suspend the peace mediation effort, as you mentioned. Specifically, he complained on his social media that Putin did not want to stop the war, and he was just tapping along. And Trump also added that Putin may need to be dealt with differently, possibly with more sanctions. And the State Secretary, Marco Rubio, mentioned that President Trump has made real progress in ending the war, but the last couple of steps of the negotiations could be difficult or hard. And he said that the coming weeks would be very critical for the White House because it'll make a determination about whether it want to continue to be involved in the negotiations. So taken together, it shows that Trump government is ramping up pressure on Russia to reach a deal. And meanwhile, it was reported that Ukrainians saw a small glimmer of hope that Trump would not force Ukraine into a lopsided peace plan after Zelenskyy had a meeting with Trump in Rome recently. So considering that both Russia and Ukraine will have no other viable option to end the war if the U.S. leaves the negotiations, so I think that they will come back and will be more active to narrow down the gaps and make a progress for the ceasefire deal. But I want to make sure that it's just making a progress for the ceasefire deal, not the peace agreement or something like that. So if they agreed to make a ceasefire deal, then they will also have just the beginning of a long, difficult, the truce agreement or the peace treaty. It will never be easy.
Right. So we're just actually at the beginning of negotiations. Now let's circle back to Trump's kind of favoring of Russia in this context. Trump has hinted at the possibility of imposing banking-related sanctions and secondary sanctions on Russia, which continues its offensive in Ukraine. Now, amid criticism that this whole negotiation process is leaning towards Russia, Dr. Davis, do you think this move could be seen as an attempt to kind of maintain balance?
I'm not convinced that sanctions are that effective in this case because we've had fairly significant sanctions imposed on Russia since they invaded Ukraine in 2022. And the sanctions process has been largely ineffective for the simple reason that China has supported Russia in terms of allowing Russia favorable trade terms, investing in Russia's economy, providing Russia with military-related technologies that Russia can then use to support its defense industrial base. So I think that when you look at that, you look at the fact that other members of the Global South have allowed Russia to circumvent the sanctions. I'm not convinced that Western imposed sanctions really are doing the job here. Yes, that's certainly an option for the Trump administration if it's clear, and it is clear, that Russia is not interested in peace, or at least not interested in peace unless it's on Moscow's terms. But ultimately, at the end of the day, for the Trump administration then to move to impose secondary sanctions and other economic measures may ultimately fail to achieve any pressure at all, because Russia will simply fall back on its support base from China and the global south, and those sanctions will become less effective.
Well, that's indeed a concerning situation. Now, let's also touch upon the funeral of Pope Francis. As you mentioned earlier, President Trump and Zelenskyy held a brief meeting, first encounter since their failed White House talks. The U.S. has described the meeting as quite productive. Do you think the latest encounter could be able to narrow the differences and move forward with the ceasefire talks?
Yes, we needed what happened for both sides of the negotiations, like U.S. and Ukraine in this case. And as you mentioned, first, the White House mentioned that the President Trump had a very productive discussion with Zelenskyy when they met ahead of the funeral of Pope Francis. And on the Ukrainian side, the spokesman for Ukraine's government also called the meeting constructive. And President Zelenskyy said on his social media that it was a good meeting and they discussed a lot one-on-one. And he also said that he hopes for results on issues they covered, like protecting lives of his people, full and unconditional ceasefire, and reliable and lasting peace that will prevent another war from breaking out. And meanwhile, after having the meeting with Zelenskyy, Trump criticized President Putin of delaying the ceasefire negotiations and mentioned the possibility of imposing additional sanctions. So it shows that the two countries, U.S. and Ukraine, seemed to make a progress in narrowing down the gaps on ending the war. Actually, we don't know yet what kind of the alternatives and the proposals the Zelenskyy offered to the President Trump when they met. But anyway, so it's uncertain how quickly Russia would accept the U.S. mediation proposal. But such a progress between U.S. and Ukraine could give a pressure to Russia that it needed to something for the ceasefire deal. And I mentioned that Russia succeeded in restoring the control for Kursk recently. So I expect that Russia will show a little bit different position in terms of moving forward further ceasefire deal.
So even though it was a short conversation, it could be quite symbolic at this timing. Now, as Professor Min has mentioned, the Russian media reports has claimed that Russia has fully regained control over the key battleground of Kursk, and Ukraine has denied these reports, calling them untrue. Dr. Davis, so if Russia's claim about retaking Kursk turns out to be accurate, how might this shift the dynamics of the ceasefire negotiations?
I think it would make the situation worse or more difficult for Kyiv, in the sense that I know that Zelenskyy and his government were hoping that the operation in Kursk would give them bargaining leverage in any ultimate ceasefire to effectively force the Russians to withdraw from Ukrainian territories that Russia had occupied. If, in fact, the Russians have retaken Kursk, and it's not at all clear that they have, then I think it does make it more difficult for the Ukrainians going into any ceasefire negotiation. And the Russians are clearly not interested in withdrawing from any of the territories that they've occupied, and indeed, they want more territory. They've already indicated to the Trump administration that they want the rest of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, in addition to Crimea. So I think that if the Ukrainians have lost Kursk, then the Russians will be emboldened in any negotiations to strike a tougher pose. That makes it more difficult for any real peace deal to be achieved.
Now, in a rather unprecedented, unexpected move, Russia and North Korea has officially announced for the first time that North Korean troops are actually participating in the war. Given that the U.S.-mediated ceasefire talks are ongoing, Professor Min, do you think we should interpret Russia's making this public? How should we interpret that, do you think?
Yes, and for that case, we need to see what kind of demonstrations happened in both Russian and the North Korean sides. And the first, Russia acknowledged, as you mentioned, the North Korean soldiers had been fighting in its war with Ukraine, and specifically Russia confirmed North Korean combat participation and recognized the crucial role they played in liberating the Kursk region. And it is known that more than 10,000 North Korean soldiers were sent to Russia in October last year, and a large number of casualties were reported among the troops. And then North Korea sent an additional about 3,000 soldiers in this January and February, and it was claimed that they quickly adapted to the combat and contributed to Russia's reclamation of Kursk. Meanwhile, North Korea also confirmed for the first time that it has deployed the troops to Russia to support Moscow's war against Ukraine under their mutual defense treaty. As you know, the Chairman Kim signed the mutual treaty with Putin in June last year, which commits the two countries to providing military aid to each other in the event of war. And the Chairman Kim also described the military activities as a sacred mission to further consolidate friendship and solidarity with Russia and defend the honor of North Korea. So personally, I think what both Russia and North Korea acknowledged, that North Korean soldiers participate in the war, means that the North Korean soldiers almost finished their missions to Kursk, and they needed to come back to their country. As I mentioned, there have been the casualties among the North Korean troops, and they needed to go back to the country and just get out of the combat. So Pyongyang cannot hide the information anymore to its people, domestic people, and it tries to justify why it had to send its soldiers to Russia secretly. So it means that such an acknowledgement is mainly for domestic audience in North Korea, I think.
Could be a signal for troops to return back to North Korea. Now, latest reports say that President Putin told the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, who visited Russia on the 25th, that Russia is actually ready to engage in talks with Ukraine, of course, without preconditions. Dr. Davis, what's the likelihood of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, and what kind of variables could impact that?
I think that the chance of that happening is fairly low, in the sense that everyone understands that whilst Russia says they'll talk to the Ukrainians without preconditions, the conditions have already been established, in the sense that Russia has made it very clear that it wants to occupy the areas of Ukraine that it controls, including Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea, and extend control of those regions beyond the areas that they physically control. Secondly, they've indicated that Ukraine cannot join NATO. Thirdly, they've indicated that there can be no military assistance to Ukraine, that Ukraine should not be allowed to be rearmed, and certainly they oppose any Western forces going in on the ground as peacekeepers. So all of these conditions really amount to a Russian demand for Ukraine's capitulation to Moscow, effectively a surrender. And there's no real prospect of successful peace negotiations occurring if one side is demanding absolute surrender. And so I think this is what Ukraine is concerned about, that the Trump administration seems to be turning away from Ukraine and favoring Russia. That's emboldening Putin to be more and more aggressive in his demands in terms of a peace negotiation. At the same time, you have Europe trying to prepare not only to support Ukraine in the absence of the United States, but also to defend themselves against an anticipated future threat directly from Russia against NATO. So I think that really things are pretty grim. I'm not hopeful that there will be any sort of meaningful ceasefire negotiations. And if there is some sort of ceasefire, it will be a ceasefire on Russia's terms that effectively is a pause to allow Russia to rearm and regroup so that they can launch the war again in a year or two.
Right, so it's indeed a complex situation, and it's easier said than done. Now, amid this situation, Professor Min, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that this week will be critical in determining whether U.S. will continue its mediation efforts. What's your outlook?
Well, personally, I think that the Trump government is leading the ceasefire negotiation, and such an effort will make a progress in the coming weeks. And as I mentioned earlier today, it seems that Russia is delaying the negotiations. And I think that Russia will accept the security guarantee proposal that Ukraine will not join the NATO. But territorial division side, it's not possible for Russia to move forward the negotiations without fully restoring the Kursk region. But recently it was reported, as I mentioned, the Russia fully restored the control of the Kursk region. So Russia got nothing standing in before it going forward in terms of the ceasefire deal. And I also think that Russia is fully aware that Trump government should be the best negotiating partner to get more of what Russia wants and make the ceasefire deal in favor of Russia. So you can easily remember what happened in the previous Biden government in terms of treating the Russia harshly. So I expect that Russia will be more active to make a progress in the ceasefire deal in the coming weeks. And unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't have any card in terms of the blocking or preventing the ceasefire deal from moving forward. So, but it does not mean that they will smoothly reach a final peace agreement. Instead, they will just move forward further ceasefire deal negotiation. So it means that they will also have another hurdle in terms of the moving forward further the truce agreement, peace treaty. It will never be easy.
So it is indeed a very crucial moment, and the decision made could define the next chapter of the conflict. So we'll be actually keeping close tabs on the situation. But for now, we'll have to wrap up our discussion at this point. Thank you so much for your insights and your time, Professor Min.
Thank you.
And of course, Dr. Davis, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.